On a moonless October night, deep in the West Virginia mountains, the forest held its breath. The only sound was the rhythmic lurch of a heavy train fighting its way up the grade. Flip, flap, flip, flap. Then, a brilliant beam of light sliced through the darkness, pinning a man to the tracks. In the next instant, the gorge erupted in a firestorm of gunfire that echoed off the ancient canyon walls. The newspapers called it a victory for law and order, the end of the notorious McGraw gang. But was that the whole truth? Tonight, we follow the echoes of that gunfire back in time. We'll push past the headlines and Pinkerton reports to the whispers in the hollows where these men were called something other than criminals. They were called heroes. We are going to find the truth behind the legend of the McGraw brothers and what really happened on the last fateful run of the train they called the flip-flap. Before the gunfire and the legend, there was just the hollow. Life there moved with the sun and the seasons, not the ticking of a pocket watch. Morning mist clung to the valleys like a shroud, burning off to reveal hillsides thick with rhododendron and ancient hardwoods. The air smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and pine. The only clock you needed was the ache in your back that told you it was time to rest, and the rumble in your belly that told you it was time to eat. This wasn't just a place. It was a world unto itself, governed by the creek, the forest, and the sky. At the heart of this world was the McGraw family's small plot of land, anchored by a cabin built from chestnut logs by their grandfather's own hands. It wasn't much by a city man's standards, just a few acres of stubborn corn, a spring house dug into the cool earth, and a porch that overlooked the whole valley. But to them, it was everything. Every stone in the chimney, every well-worn plank on the floor, was a testament to the family's sweat and survival. This land was their memory, their birthright, and their future, all tied up in one. The three brothers were as much a part of this landscape as the trees. Elias, the eldest, was the quiet one, with eyes that saw the world in lines and angles. He'd find strange patterns in the stars and could sketch a map of the surrounding ridges from memory that was truer than any government survey. Caleb, built like an ox, was the earth itself. His strength was a thing of local legend, but it was a quiet strength, used for felling timber and plowing the rocky soil. And then there was Finn, the youngest. He was the creek, fast, wild, and unpredictable. He knew the woods so well it was said he could track a whisper, his laughter echoing through the trees as he hunted. They weren't outlaws. They were sons of the mountain, dreaming simple dreams. Elias hoped to one day build a proper school in the valley. Caleb wanted nothing more than to marry his sweetheart and raise a family on the land he loved. Finn just wanted the freedom of the hills, the thrill of the hunt, and the respect of his kin. They were bound not just by blood, but by a shared love for this simple, hard, and honest life. But then, the outside world came creeping into their hollow. It arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet clicks of a surveyor's tripod and the rustle of papers covered in words they couldn't understand. Men in clean city clothes walked their land, driving stakes into the ground and marking ancient trees with slashes of paint. They spoke of progress, of a great steel artery that would bring wealth to the mountains. They laid a deed on the McGraw's kitchen table, a piece of paper that they claimed overrode the decades of sweat their family had poured into the soil. Their father, a man who had faced down panthers and harsh winters, was broken by that piece of paper. The family lost the better part of their land, the very heart of their homestead, for pennies on the dollar. The surveyor's paint on the trees felt like a scar, and the rumble they soon heard in the distance, the sound of dynamite blasting a path for the railroad, was a constant, gut-wrenching reminder of their helplessness. The world they knew was being carved up and hauled away, one coal car at a time. And with every distant train whistle that cut through the quiet of the hollow, a cold, hard knot of resentment tightened in the hearts of the three McGraw brothers. That land wasn't just dirt and rock. It was a living history, paid for in blood and sacrifice. The first McGraw to set foot in that hollow was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, a man who had fought the British at King's Mountain. He was given the land as a grant, a reward for helping to forge a new nation. He didn't receive a tidy deed from a lawyer's office. He received a promise, which he then had to make real with his own hands. He cleared the timber, fought off panthers, and built a life from scratch, believing he had earned a piece of the freedom he fought for. His title wasn't written on paper. It was carved into the very landscape. A generation later, another war came to test the family's resolve. When the country split in two during the Civil War, these mountains became a hornet's nest of divided loyalties. Neighbors took up arms against neighbors. The McGraws, like many mountain folk, cared little for the politics of Richmond or Washington. Their loyalty was to their own kin and their own hollow. They refused to fight for a cause they didn't believe in, hiding their sons and their livestock from recruiters of both armies. This taught them a bitter lesson. When powerful men draw lines on a map, it's the common folk who bleed. It deepened their distrust of any authority that came from beyond their own ridgelines. Because of this history, a name like McGraw carried a weight as heavy as a blacksmith's anvil. It was more than just a name, it was a code. To be a McGraw meant you didn't bow to anyone. It meant your handshake was a binding contract, and your land was an extension of your own soul. You were expected to be quiet, neighborly, and God-fearing. But if someone wronged you or yours, if they took what was earned by the sweat of your ancestors, you were bound by honor to see it set right. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about balance. So when the railroad company came with its lawyers and its fraudulent deeds, they weren't just stealing property. They were spitting on the grave of that revolutionary soldier. They were dismissing the family's century of hardship and self-reliance as if it meant nothing. In the eyes of Elias, Caleb, and Finn, this wasn't a business transaction. It was a declaration of war. They felt the weight of their name, the gaze of their ancestors, and they knew that the code they lived by demanded a response. The roots of this feud ran far deeper than a single property line. They were tangled in the very soul of the mountains. But the McGraw's defiance, born of honor, wasn't shared by everyone. For every family that nodded in grim approval, there were two more who had already bent the knee. They'd taken the railroad's meager pay, moved into company shacks, and learned to keep their heads down. These folks saw the McGraws not as heroes, but as a threat, a dangerous reminder of a pride they could no longer afford. And this division created the perfect breeding ground for suspicion and bad blood to fester. The face of this division, the human face of the railroad's power in their valley, was a man named Jedediah Stone. Stone's family had been rivals of the McGraws for generations, always competing for the best bottomland or the biggest timber contracts. When the railroad came, Stone saw his chance. He became their local man, a land agent and foreman who walked with the swagger of borrowed authority. It was Stone who had delivered the final papers to the McGraw's father, and it was said he did so with a smirk on his face. He was one of them, but he had chosen a side. The tension first boiled over in public, right in front of Abernathy's general store. Jed Stone was bragging about the new survey lines, how they'd be running track right through the McGraw's old hunting grounds. Caleb, who was there to buy salt, overheard him. He didn't say a word at first, just stood there, his massive frame filling the doorway. The store went silent. Stone, emboldened by his new position, made the mistake of pushing. "Something on your mind, McGraw," he sneered. The fistfight that followed was short, brutal, and left Stone with a broken nose and a mouthful of dirt. He didn't get up until Caleb was long gone, but the hatred in his eyes could have set fire to the building. After that, the whispers started. They were quiet at first, traded over checkerboards and sacks of flour. Jed Stone and his cronies began to paint the McGraws as violent and unhinged. Caleb's got a temper that ain't natural, they'd say, and that Finn, he's half wild, spends more time in the woods than with decent folk. The rumors, like kudzu vine, began to snake their way through the hollows, choking the truth. Elias tried to cut through it with reason. even attempting to negotiate a fair price for timber from their remaining land. Stone, acting as the company agent, laughed and offered him a fraction of its worth, knowing they had no other way to get it to market. The insult was as sharp as a slap in the face. The poison had seeped deep into the community, turning old neighbors into quiet enemies and small grudges into deadly threats. It started with the whispers of the woods themselves. An old she-panther, whose territory was miles up the ridge, began to scream at dusk just beyond their clearing, a sound like a woman being murdered, a cry that made the hair on your arms stand up. One evening, the sunset bled across the sky in a shade of red so deep and unnatural that the old folks called it a blood sky, a sure sign that the earth was about to drink its fill. Even the wind seemed to change its tune, moaning through the pines, not with the familiar sigh of the mountains, but with a sound like a mother weeping for her lost sons. These were the old signs, the omens the McGraw's grandmother had taught them to heed, and they settled like a cold frost on their spirits. Then, the human omen arrived. He wasn't a railroad bull or a county sheriff. He was a man named Sterling, a detective from the Pinkerton Agency. He didn't ride in with a posse. He simply appeared one day at Abernathy's store, looking as out of place as a Bible in a saloon. He wore a dark city suit, a bowler hat, and his face was clean-shaven and pale. He didn't speak much, just bought some tobacco and sat on the porch, watching. But it was the way he watched that unnerved everyone. He didn't look at the mountains with wonder. He looked at them like a grid on a map. He studied the faces of the local men, not with curiosity, but with a cold, detached calculation, the way a butcher studies a side of beef. Elias saw him that day and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He was a planner, a man who understood strategy, and in Sterling's quiet, assessing gaze, he saw a different kind of mind at work. This wasn't a man who could be intimidated by Caleb's strength or charmed by Finn's smile. This was a patient hunter, a man who would use traps and wires and logic, not just guns. That night, Elias sat on his porch, the familiar ridges and stars offering no comfort. A profound and unshakable dread settled deep in his gut. He knew, with a certainty that defied reason, that the game had changed. They were no longer just striking back at a faceless company. A reckoning was coming, and the game was no longer theirs to control. The breaking point didn't come with a roar, but with the quiet, rhythmic scrape of shovels against sacred ground. Finn was tracking a buck high on the ridge when he heard it, an unnatural sound in the one place that should have been silent. Creeping through the underbrush, he froze. Below him, in the small clearing that held the McGraw family graves, a work crew was driving stakes. Jedediah Stone stood among them, pointing, directing. They were marking a path for the tracks, and the line went right through the weathered headstones of his grandparents. The cold dread he'd felt for months instantly turned into white-hot rage. He didn't run back to the cabin screaming. The fury was too deep for that. He walked, cold and deliberate, and his brothers saw the look in his eyes and knew. Together, the three of them walked back up the ridge. They weren't armed for a fight. Elias carried only the original tattered land grant from the war, a last, desperate appeal to history and honor. They found Stone's crew about to pry loose the first of the fieldstone markers. "Stop," Elias said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a judge. "This is consecrated ground. Your company's deed has no claim here." Jed Stone turned slowly, a smug, contemptuous grin spreading across his face. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near the oldest grave. "Your deed is a piece of history, Elias. This," he said, waving the company's official survey, "is the law. And the law says, I own every leaf, rock, and bone on this mountain. Now, I'm telling you for the last time, get off company property before I have you removed." He gave a sharp nod to one of his men, a hard-faced guard with a pistol holstered on his hip. That was the spark. Finn let out a choked cry of fury and lunged, not at Stone, but at the man reaching for his grandmother's headstone. In the same motion, the guard drew his pistol. A deafening crack echoed through the clearing, and Finn was thrown back, a dark red line blooming on his forearm. The sight of his brother's blood broke something in Caleb. The quiet, gentle giant was gone. In his place was a force of nature. With a roar that seemed to shake the very trees, he charged into the work crew. It was over in seconds. The sound of a man's jaw breaking under Caleb's fist was like a dry branch snapping. He threw one man into a briar patch and disarmed the guard before he could fire again. He grabbed Jedediah Stone by the shirt front, lifted him clean off the ground, and hurled him down the hillside. The crew scrambled away like frightened squirrels, dragging their wounded, leaving a silence broken only by Caleb's ragged breathing. The first blood had been spilled. And in that moment, standing over the desecrated graves of their ancestors with the scent of gunpowder in the air, the McGraws knew their old life was over. They weren't farmers anymore. They were fugitives. The familiar heavy rhythm began its count in the darkness. Flip-flap, flip-flap. It was the sound of opportunity, the dinner bell that had called them to work so many times before. From his perch high on the ridge, Elias watched the train's single headlight cut a weak yellow path through the night. Below, he saw the faint shadows of his brothers moving into position. The small, muffled blast of dynamite was perfect, sending just enough rock onto the tracks to stop the beast in its tracks. The train hissed to a halt, its steam sounding like a great sigh of relief. It was their signature, a symphony of steel and rock they had perfected. But as Caleb and Finn stepped from the cover of the rhododendron, the symphony stopped. A new kind of silence fell over the gorge, a silence that felt heavy, watched. And then, the night was torn open. A brilliant electric searchlight mounted on the engine's tender flared to life, a single blinding eye that burned away the shadows and turned Finn into a statue of terror. In that same frozen second, a whistle blew from the woods, and the gorge answered. It wasn't just gunfire. It was a solid wall of noise, a physical force that seemed to press in from all sides. From his ridge, Elias saw the tree line across the canyon erupt in dozens of angry, blinking stars. The sharp cracks of rifles and the deep boom of shotguns all blended into one continuous, deafening roar. He saw his brothers, caught in that merciless white light, suddenly stripped of their legendary status. They were just men, terribly exposed and tragically outmatched. The wooden walls of the mail car began to splinter and peel away under the assault, silent witnesses to the storm. Bullets ricocheted off the steel wheels with a high, mournful whine. A lantern hanging on a hook shattered, its brief flare of orange light swallowed by the chaos. The air, thick with the smell of coal smoke and damp leaves, was suddenly choked with the acrid, biting scent of burnt gunpowder. Men were shouting, their commands lost in the thunder, their cries cut unnaturally short. From his vantage point, a helpless god watching his world be unmade, Elias saw his brother Caleb become the focal point of the storm. The big man didn't run. He roared, a sound of pure, primal defiance, and stood his ground, his shotgun bucking against his shoulder, trying to provide a shadow for Finn to escape into. But there were too many flashes, too many angry hornets in the air. Then the great shadow faltered. He didn't cry out. He simply folded, falling with a terrible slowness, a great stone monument toppling back into the earth from which he came. Finn, fast as a whisper, almost made it. He moved like a ghost through the strobing effect of the muzzle flashes, a phantom of the woods, even in this hellscape. He was just feet from the safety of the dark tree line when a single sharp crack cut through the din, and the ghost stumbled. His leg buckled beneath him, and he fell into the unforgiving beam of the searchlight, no longer a spirit of the mountain, but just a boy on the ground. His flight ended. The firing stopped as suddenly as it began. The ringing silence that rushed in was more terrifying than the noise it replaced. The searchlight continued its slow, indifferent sweep across the scene, illuminating the splintered wood, the pockmarked rocks, and the still, dark shape that had been Caleb McGraw. Elias lay flat against the cold stone of his lookout, the smoke burning his lungs, a ghost left behind to witness the slaughter of his family. For Detective Sterling, this was never about justice, and it was certainly not about honor. It was about solving a problem. From his temporary office in the county seat, surrounded by maps, train schedules, and telegraph reports, he saw the entire situation as a complex equation. The McGraw brothers were not men. They were a variable, an unpredictable disruption to the orderly flow of commerce. And his job, the job he was paid very well for, was to eliminate that variable. His initial attempts to hunt them had been a source of immense professional frustration. His best agents, men who could track a pickpocket through the most crowded city streets, were useless here. They stumbled through the woods like cattle, leaving a trail a blind man could follow. They were spooked by the silence, by the feeling of being constantly watched. Sterling quickly realized that trying to beat the McGraws in their world, by their rules, was a fool's errand. They were part of the mountain. He was not. It was a tactical disadvantage he could not overcome with manpower alone. That's when the switch flipped in his mind. He stopped thinking like a detective trying to catch a criminal and started thinking like an engineer trying to fix a faulty machine. If you can't get to the broken gear, you don't keep reaching for it. You change the entire mechanism. He decided that if you can't hunt the wolves in their den, you burn the whole forest down. His plan, the searchlight, the dozens of hidden riflemen, the coordinated telegraph signals, was never designed to be an arrest. It was an extermination, planned with the cold precision of a mathematician solving for X. The risk of a shootout during a capture attempt, the possibility of escape, the circus of a trial, these were all inefficient outcomes. The solution was overwhelming, inescapable, lethal force. And so, as the telegraph key in his office clicked out the final report from the gorge, targets neutralized, 1 KIA, 1 captured, assets secure, Sterling felt no thrill of victory. He felt no remorse. He felt a quiet, profound sense of satisfaction. It was the feeling an architect gets when a bridge holds its weight, the feeling a watchmaker has when the last gear clicks into place and the second hand begins its perfect, steady sweep. He didn't picture Caleb McGraw's body cooling on the tracks or hear the echo of the gunfire. He saw a closed file, a completed contract, a problem solved. He simply folded the telegram, made a neat entry in his ledger, and began drafting his final invoice for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. When the last echo of gunfire faded, an unnatural silence fell upon the gorge. It was a dead quiet, heavier and more profound than the peace that had preceded it. The only sounds were the soft hiss of steam from the wounded train and the slow drip of water from the rocks. The searchlight continued its steady, unblinking sweep, painting the scene in stark, ghostly whites and deep, inky blacks. Men in dark coats emerged from the trees, not with whoops of victory, but with the grim, methodical purpose of undertakers. This wasn't the aftermath of a fight. It was the cleanup of an execution. They found Finn first, trying to drag himself toward the darkness of the forest. The wild spirit that danced in his eyes was gone, extinguished and replaced by a glassy look of shock and pain. They hauled him to his feet, his wounded leg buckling, and bound his hands without a word. The phantom of the woods, the boy who could move like a whisper, was now just a prisoner. His world shrunk to the cold iron of handcuffs and the hard stares of his captors. He didn't struggle. He just stared past them, at the still, dark shape lying by the tracks. That shape was Caleb. The great mountain bear lay still, his massive frame looking strangely out of place against the orderly lines of the railroad ties. The lawmen gathered around him, their lanterns casting flickering shadows that made it seem for a moment like he might still be breathing. But he was gone. His strength, which could bend a railroad spike and uproot a stump, had been no match for a dozen well-aimed bullets. He had died on his feet, a human shield, a final, futile act of love for his younger brother. High above, hidden by rock and shadow, Elias watched it all. He saw them bind Finn. He saw them stand over Caleb's body. A wave of grief so cold and sharp it almost made him cry out, washed over him. But he choked it down, turning it into ice in his veins. He couldn't help them. To reveal himself now would be a fool's death, an insult to Caleb's sacrifice. His mind, the planner's mind, took over. He wasn't a brother anymore. He was a survivor, a witness, a memory. Without a sound, he backed away from the ledge and melted into the deep woods, disappearing into the one place they could swallowed by the mountain that had been his home. By dawn, the gorge was crawling with railroad detectives and county lawmen. The telegraph wires hummed with the news. The McGraw gang was broken. The official story, crafted by Sterling himself, was already being printed in the Charleston papers. They were described as a pack of bloodthirsty animals, and their end was hailed as a triumph for progress. A warrant was issued for the last remaining brother, Elias McGraw, and a bounty was placed on his head, $500, dead or alive. It was a fortune in these parts, a sum large enough to make a man forget all about loyalty, kinship, and the old mountain code. The news of the shootout didn't arrive in the hollows on the pages of a newspaper. It came in whispers, carried by a shaken trainman, then a track walker, spreading from cabin to cabin like a contagion. The stories were fractured and full of horror. The blinding light, the sheer volume of the gunfire, the sight of Caleb McGraw's body. Then came the official story, crisp and clean as a new dollar bill, printed in the Charleston papers that Jedediah Stone left in a stack at Abernathy's store. It spoke of a heroic police action against a gang of violent thieves. And just like that, a line was drawn straight through the heart of the community. At the store, the old pot-bellied stove became a silent border. On one side sat the company men, the foremen and railroad guards, drinking coffee and nodding along as Stone read the heroic accounts aloud. On the other side sat the old-timers, the farmers and miners whose families had been there for generations. They said nothing. They just stared into the flames, their faces hard and unreadable, the silence in their corner of the room more powerful than all of Stone's boasting. The church congregation split too. One faction prayed for the souls of the lawmen who had restored order, while the other half offered quiet, veiled prayers for the lost and the grieving. A deep and chilling fear settled over the hills. People had seen what the railroad and its hired guns were capable of. They had brought an army into that gorge, and the law had blessed it. Men who might have known the McGraw's movements, who might have been able to offer a truer account of what happened, suddenly developed terrible memories. When questioned by Pinkerton agents or the county sheriff, their answers were a chorus of "don't know" and "didn't see." It wasn't a conspiracy to protect the McGraw's legacy, it was a conspiracy of self-preservation. They understood the new math of survival. The railroad's power was absolute, and speaking the truth could get you fired, evicted, or worse. A blanket of collective silence was pulled over the hollows, smothering the facts of that night. But even in that suffocating silence, small acts of courage flickered like candle flames in a storm. An anonymous sack of cornmeal and salted pork was left on the porch of a distant McGraw cousin. The blacksmith, a man who had known Caleb since he was a boy, told Jed Stone his forge was too busy to shoe his horse and left the animal standing. These were quiet rebellions, tiny gestures that went unnoticed by the men in charge, but they were messages understood by everyone else. They were a signal that while the body of the community might have been broken, its spirit, the old mountain code of loyalty, was not yet dead. It was a spirit that would be tested to its absolute limit by the crisp new posters that soon appeared, nailed to the door of the store and the biggest trees in the valley, announcing the $500 bounty on Elias McGraw. The hunt for Elias McGraw began not as a noble pursuit of justice, but as a business venture. Detective Sterling, a man who believed in systems and efficiency, organized the posse. He knew his own Pinkerton agents were liabilities in this terrain, so he leveraged the bounty. The $500 reward drew a rough collection of men down from the hills, men with cold eyes and worn-out boots, who knew the ridges but whose loyalty was only to the silver dollar. To lead this motley crew, Sterling appointed Jedediah Stone. Puffed up with a new sense of authority and burning with personal vengeance, Stone swore he knew every path and hideout Elias could possibly use. They set out with a confidence bordering on arrogance, a clumsy army crashing through a silent world. They were loud, their city boots snapping twigs and dislodging stones, their voices carrying for miles in the still mountain air. They were hunting a ghost, but they sounded like a herd of buffalo. The mountains, in turn, seemed to conspire against them. Sudden, chilling rains would turn the trails to mud, washing away any potential tracks. Thick fog would descend into the valleys without warning, swallowing landmarks and turning the men back on their own trails. They were outsiders, and the ancient landscape seemed to be actively resisting their intrusion. Days bled into a week, then two. The mood of the posse soured. The bounty hunters grew restless and suspicious of one another, each man fearing another would find the trail first and claim the prize. Jed Stone's confident boasts turned to frustrated curses as every certain location proved empty. The men began to feel the oppressive weight of the forest's silence. They started at every shadow, mistaking the cry of a hawk for a signal. The man they were hunting became less a fugitive and more a myth. They spoke of him in hushed tones around the campfire, calling him the Haint of the Ridge. Elias was no longer just a man on the run. He was the spirit of the mountain itself, and he was hunting them back. Their break came from a place of desperation. An old trapper, his family facing a hard winter, was quietly approached by one of Sterling's men. For a fraction of the bounty, paid in cash, he reluctantly drew a crude map on a piece of bark. It showed a forgotten network of limestone caves near the highest ridge, a place the old folks called the Devil's Pantry. It was a treacherous, hidden place, a perfect bolt hole. The trapper's information reignited the posse's hope. This was it. They had a destination. They had a trap to set. They approached the caves at dusk, moving with a caution they hadn't shown before. Spreading out, they formed a tight cordon around the main entrance, rifles at the ready. Stone and a few of the bravest men crept forward. Inside the mouth of the largest cave, they found the proof they needed. The embers of a fire, still faintly warm, and a single spent rifle cartridge lying on the ground. A wave of triumphant excitement shot through the men. He was here. They had him cornered. With a signal, they rushed in, their lanterns cutting through the subterranean darkness, their shouts echoing off the damp stone walls. The main cavern was empty. They searched every corner, every shadow, finding nothing. Defeat began to settle in until one of the bounty hunters noticed a faint draft coming from the very back of the cave. Behind a curtain of rock, they found it. A fissure no wider than a man's shoulders, a tight, twisting passage that snaked through the mountain's core and opened out onto a different valley a mile away. It was a bolt hole no map would ever show, a secret passed down through generations. Elias had been there. He had likely watched them assemble, listened to them approach, and then simply slipped away through the heart of the stone, leaving them to storm an empty room. The hunt was over. The ghost had vanished for good, leaving behind only the cold, damp air of an empty cave and the bitter taste of utter humiliation. The trial of Finn McGraw was a piece of theatre, and everyone in the county courthouse knew their part. The building itself felt like an occupied territory, with grim-faced Pinkerton agents standing guard at the doors, their long coats failing to hide the pistols on their hips. The room was divided as sharply as a clear-cut forest. On one side sat the railroad officials, the company men, and Jedediah Stone, all looking confident and righteous. On the other, clustered together for warmth, were the mountain folk, their faces a mixture of fear, grief. He was thinner now, the wildness in his eyes replaced by a quiet, hollowed-out stillness. He was clean and wore a borrowed shirt, but he still looked like a caged animal. He never looked at the judge or the jury. His gaze was fixed on a point far away, out the window, toward the blue-hazed ridges that had once been his whole world. He was physically present, but his spirit was already gone. The prosecution was a performance of calculated cruelty. A slick lawyer from Charleston, hired by the railroad, painted Finn and his brothers as nothing short of demonic. He spoke of progress, civilization, and the sanctity of property, making the McGraws' desperate fight for their land sound like a savage assault on the very foundations of America. His star witness was Jedediah Stone, who stood on the stand, puffed up and pious, and lied with the ease of a man ordering breakfast. He spoke of an unprovoked attack, of Caleb's vain rage, and claimed the desecration of the family graves was a malicious fiction invented by the defense. When the old, tired public defender tried to call witnesses from the hollows, a wave of collective amnesia swept the room. Men who had known the McGraws their whole lives suddenly couldn't recall specific conversations. Women who had seen Finn's bleeding arm after the first confrontation now had only a vague memory of the day. Their eyes darted nervously toward the Pinkerton guards, toward Jedediah Stone, and they mumbled their answers to the floor. It was a masterful, unspoken campaign of intimidation worked perfectly. The justice of the mountains, built on honor and shared truth, withered and died under the cold glare of company power. The verdict was a formality. The jury of 12 farmers and merchants who wouldn't meet Finn's gaze deliberated for less than an hour. The foreman, a man who had bought corn from the McGraw's father for 20 years, read the word guilty in a voice that was barely a whisper. The sentence was swift: life, to be served in the stone fortress of the state penitentiary at Moundsville. As they clamped the shackles on his wrists, Finn finally broke his silence. He looked at Jedediah Stone, who was accepting congratulations from the railroad lawyer, and a faint, bitter smile touched his lips. Finn was led away, a ghost in chains, leaving a courtroom thick with the stench of a lie. The law of men had won its victory. Jedediah Stone, the man who had instigated the fight at the gravesite, the man whose greed and spite had set the whole tragedy in motion, walked out a free man and a local hero. The question that hung in the silent, heavy air was one no one dared to ask aloud. Was this justice? Or was it just the tidiest solution? For Finn McGraw, the life sentence was a death sentence delivered in slow motion. The stone walls and iron bars of Moundsville Penitentiary were more than a prison. They were a tomb. For a boy who had measured his days by the rising sun and the call of the whippoorwill, the clang of the cell door was the sound of his world ending. The endless grey walls, the stale air, the suffocating proximity of other broken men, it was a physical torment. He withered. The mountain boy, whose lungs had been filled with clean, sharp air, began to cough, a deep, rattling sound that echoed the sickness in his soul. He died 7 years later, not from the consumption that ravaged his body, but from the slow, relentless starvation of his spirit. He never once spoke of his brothers or the location of any hidden money, taking his secrets with him to a pauper's grave in the prison yard. Jedediah Stone, on the other hand, got everything he wanted. The railroad rewarded him handsomely for his loyalty, giving him a managerial position and the title to the last of the McGraw's land. He built a new, bigger house right where their old cabin had stood, a monument to his victory. But his victory was a hollow one. The whispers that had once been about the McGraws were now about him. He was no longer a neighbor. He was the company man. People were polite to his face, but their eyes were cold and distant. Men would fall silent when he entered the general store. No one invited him to barn raisings or church socials. He had the land, but he had lost the community. He grew old in that big, empty house, becoming a prisoner of his own making. He became paranoid, convinced that every shadow on the ridge was the ghost of Elias McGraw, come back for revenge. He took to carrying a pistol at all times, his nights spent staring out the window at the dark, silent mountains that seemed to be judging him. He didn't face a judge or a jury, but he served his own kind of life sentence, one of loneliness and fear. He died a bitter, solitary man, his wealth unable to buy him the one thing he had thrown away, a place among his own people. As for Detective Sterling, he barely gave the case another thought. It was a file, successfully closed. He collected his fee from the railroad and moved on to his next contract, breaking up a union strike in the coal fields of Pennsylvania with the same detached, lethal efficiency. The McGraws were just a name in a ledger, a solved equation, a footnote in a long and profitable career of enforcing the will of powerful men. And in the hollows, a deep and deliberate forgetting began. The story of the flip-flap ambush became a dangerous thing to remember, a wound that was better left to scar over. People stopped talking about it. The McGraw name was spoken only in hushed tones, a ghost story to frighten children. The railroad's power was now absolute, and survival meant accepting the new reality. The land, once a tapestry of family homesteads, was consolidated into company property. The old ways, the old code, were buried under a blanket of silence, as deep and as final as the grave. If you go looking for the McGraw name in that county today, you'll have a hard time finding it. Finn died without children, a number in a prison ledger. Elias vanished into the mists of folklore. The name, like a river driven underground, disappeared from the surface. But the bloodline didn't vanish entirely. It flows on through the descendants of cousins, quiet families who know the truth of the story, but have learned the wisdom of not speaking it too loudly. As for the Stones, their grand house, built on a foundation of betrayal, eventually fell to ruin, and their descendants sold the land and moved away, leaving behind a name that is now just a footnote in the county records. The most powerful echo of that night is etched into the land itself. The main railroad line doesn't run through the gorge the same way anymore. It was straightened and modernized decades ago, a safer, faster route blasted through the rock. But if you know where to look, if you're willing to hike through thick brush and over fallen trees, you can still find the old bed. The flip-flap curve is still there, a silent curving scar on the mountainside. The tracks are long gone, but you can still see the rotting ties, half swallowed by the earth, ghosts of steel and progress. To stand in that silent curve is to feel the weight of what happened there. The air is still thick with it. Just a few hundred yards from that curve, up on a small rise, you'll find a tangle of briars and a scattering of old foundation stones. This is where Jedediah Stone's house stood, and before that, the McGraw cabin. And if you search the ground nearby, you will find nothing. No trace of the family graveyard. That's because when the railroad men laid their tracks, they needed to build up the grade. They took the easiest path. They simply built their embankment right over top of it. The weathered headstones of the McGraw's ancestors, the very flashpoint of the whole tragedy, are buried deep beneath the tons of rock and earth that support the abandoned line. The history they died defending is now crushed under the weight of the thing that destroyed them. People forget. Documents burn and names fade from tombstones, but the mountains remember everything. They don't keep records in ink, but in stone and shadow and silence. The locals say that on a cold October night, when the wind is just right, you can still hear a sound echoing from that abandoned cut. A sound like the lurching of a heavy train. Flip-flap, flip-flap. It's a story the land itself refuses to let die. Because while the law of men may have written the official history, the mountains hold the truth in their very bones. So we come back to the question we started with. Were the McGraw brothers just a gang of ruthless criminals? The official record, written in the neat, confident hand of men like Detective Sterling, would say yes. They were a violent disruption, an obstacle to progress that was efficiently and justly removed. But the truth, as it so often is in these mountains, is a far more complicated thing. They were men who were pushed until they had no choice but to push back. Men who chose to break the law rather than break the code they were raised by. This has been more than the story of a forgotten gunfight. It's a story about the birth of modern America and the price that was paid for it. For every mile of track that was laid, for every ton of coal that was ripped from the earth, A piece of an older world was buried. The McGraws weren't just fighting the railroad, they were fighting against erasure. They were the last defiant roar of a way of life that was being silenced forever. And in the end, the most powerful weapon used against them wasn't a rifle in the dark. It was the pen that wrote the official history, the one that turned their righteous fury into a simple act of criminal greed. But a story like this never truly dies. It seeps into the soil. It whispers on the wind that blows through that lonely, abandoned gorge. Some say the ghost of Elias McGraw still walks those ridges, a silent guardian of a buried truth, a permanent echo of defiance. He stands as a quiet, eternal reminder that you can kill a man, you can silence a community, and you can pave over the past. But you can never ever kill a story that deserves to be told. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. They say that on misty nights, when the moon is just a sliver over the Appalachian peaks, the ghost of a red-haired man can be seen wandering the old Cherokee lands. He walks through the ghosts of towns he himself burned to the ground, Chota, Tellico, Chilhowie, forever hearing the cries of those his campaigns left to starve in the winter cold. This restless spirit, they say, is Arthur Campbell, a man his own people called the Red Fox, a celebrated founder of southwestern Virginia and a protector of the frontier. Was he the necessary guardian of a fledgling civilization, forced into brutal acts to save his kin? Or was he a monster of ambition, who used total war to carve out an empire from the ashes of another people? Today, we're going to untangle the legend from the man. We will follow the trail of the Red Fox, from his capture as a boy to his reign as a political king, to understand how one person could become both a revered pioneer and the eternal, haunting specter of the lands he conquered. To understand the Red Fox, you have to understand the world that made him. The late 1700s in Augusta County, Virginia, was not a place of gentle living. It was the absolute edge of the known world, a raw frontier where life was measured in seasons and survival was a daily struggle. Arthur Campbell was born into this world in 1743, the son of Scots-Irish immigrants. These weren't people who bowed to kings or coastal aristocrats. They were clannish, stubborn, and fiercely independent, and they had pushed into the mountains seeking land that they could hold by the strength of their own hands. This environment was a forge, and it hammered boys into hard men. But for Arthur, the true crucible came when he was just 15 years old. During the French and Indian War, while out on a mission, the boy was captured by a party of Wyandot warriors. For most, this was a death sentence, or a life of brutal servitude. For Arthur Campbell, it became a dark and transformative education. He was taken hundreds of miles away, deep into the Ohio country near the Great Lakes, and for nearly 3 years, he lived as they lived. He wasn't just a captive, he was a student of survival. He learned their languages, he learned to track game and to move through the forest without a sound. But most importantly, he learned their way of war. He saw firsthand the art of the ambush, the psychological terror of the raid, and the supreme value of cunning over brute force. He watched how they used the very landscape as a weapon, melting into the woods like ghosts. These were lessons that could not be taught in any European army. Then, after almost 3 years, he made his escape. It was a harrowing journey, hundreds of miles through a hostile wilderness with nothing but the skills he had learned from his captors. He survived on nuts, roots, and an iron will. The boy who was captured in that mountain pass was gone forever. The one who stumbled back into the Virginia settlements was a young man, but with the cold, ancient eyes of a survivor. He was harder, sharper, and infinitely more dangerous. The wilderness had tried to swallow him whole, and in the process, he had swallowed a piece of it right back. The man who returned from the Ohio wilderness was not the same one who had left. With his shock of red hair and a new, unsettling stillness in his eyes, he quickly earned the nickname that would follow him to the grave, the Red Fox. He settled in the Holston River Valley, a beautiful but dangerous stretch of land that would become the heart of his domain. Here, in a time of relative quiet, the Red Fox built a life. He married Margaret Campbell, a cousin, and together they began to raise a family that would eventually number 13 children. In these years, before the great wars that would define his legacy, Campbell was seen as the quintessential pillar of the frontier community. He was a successful farmer, a surveyor, and a man whose counsel was sought on everything from planting corn to fortifying a cabin against attack. He became a justice of the peace and a captain in the local militia. When there was a dispute between neighbors, they brought it to Arthur Campbell. When a hunting party went missing, it was Arthur Campbell who organized the search. He was the anchor in a sea of uncertainty. His authority came from his experience. The other settlers were brave and tough, but Campbell possessed a deeper, colder knowledge. He understood the forest and the men who moved through it in a way no one else did. He taught his neighbors how to read the signs of an approaching war party, how to fight from behind trees instead of in open lines, and how to think like the enemy. He was their shield, the man who had been inside the belly of the beast and returned to tell them how to slay it. This was the world the Red Fox built and fought to protect, a fragile collection of cabins and clearings, filled with his kin and his neighbors, all clinging to a precarious existence at the edge of a continent. It was a life built on family loyalty, community dependence, and the constant simmering threat of violence. The love he had for his wife and children, and the fierce paternalistic duty he felt for the people who looked to him for safety, became the driving forces behind every decision he would ever make. Everything that came later, all the fire and the blood, was done to protect this small world he had carved out of the wilderness. But a man forged in such a fire is often left with brittle places. Arthur Campbell's greatest strength, that unyielding will to protect his family and his domain, was inextricably bound to his fatal flaw, an absolute, unshakable belief that his authority was the only authority that mattered. He had survived where others had perished. He had brought order to a land of chaos, and in his mind, this gave him a right to rule. He saw himself not as a leader, but as the patriarch of the entire region, and any challenge to his will was not a simple disagreement. It was a threat to the natural order of things. There's a story that perfectly illustrates this. A few years after the Revolution, a new family of settlers arrived with a land grant signed and sealed by the authorities back in Richmond. The tract of land they claimed overlapped with pasture that one of Campbell's sons had been using. By the letter of the law, the new family had the stronger claim. But that was a law made by men in powdered wigs hundreds of miles away. Campbell summoned the family's patriarch to his home. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply sat the man down and explained, in his quiet, cold way, that the laws of Richmond were a distant whisper in these mountains. The only law that kept families safe from famine or the tomahawk was the law of mutual respect and established order. And in the Holston Valley, he was that order. The new settler, a proud man himself, insisted on his legal rights. Campbell just nodded. Within a week, the man found no one would trade with him at the local mill. His neighbors, loyal to Campbell, suddenly became distant and cold. When one of his cattle went missing, the search party Campbell organized found no trace of it. There was no violence, no open threat, just a slow, suffocating isolation. The family was gone within the month, their legal grant worthless against the silent, absolute power of the Red Fox. For Campbell, this wasn't about a piece of pasture land. It was about precedent. He believed that compromise was weakness, and weakness invited chaos. He could not bend, He could not yield, because to do so would be to admit that some other power, be it the government in Richmond or a rival on the frontier, had a say in the survival of his people. His authority had to be as solid and immovable as the mountains themselves. This towering pride, this inability to brook any rival or share any power, was the crack in his armor. It had served him well when crushing the will of his enemies or intimidating a lone settler. But it was a flaw that was bound to lead him into a conflict he couldn't control with a quiet word or a silent shunning. It would eventually put him face to face with men as proud and as stubborn as himself, and in the unforgiving calculus of the frontier, such a collision could only be settled with fire and blood. The ink on the treaty that ended the revolution was barely dry, but peace never lasts long in the mountains. The new conflict, however, wouldn't be fought with tomahawks and rifles, but with petitions, politics, and the threat of civil war. Just south of Campbell's domain, in the settlements along the Watauga and Nolichucky rivers, a storm was brewing. These lands, technically part of North Carolina, were populated by the same hardened over-mountain men Campbell had fought beside. When North Carolina, in a political move, ceded these western lands to the federal government, the settlers felt abandoned, left without laws or protection. So they did something unthinkable. They did what mountain people have always done when ignored by a distant government. They formed their own. In 1784, they declared themselves an independent state, writing a constitution and electing a governor. They called their new nation the State of Franklin. From his home in the Holston Valley, Arthur Campbell watched this unfold, not as a distant observer, but as a predator watches a rival enter its territory. This wasn't some far-off tax dispute. This was a new center of power, a new government, rising on his very doorstep. For a man whose entire identity was built on being the supreme, unchallenged authority of his region, this was the ultimate affront. The existence of Franklin, led by the popular war hero John Sevier, was a direct challenge to his throne. It siphoned away influence, it offered an alternative to his leadership, and it threatened to make him a secondary figure in the story of the West. It violated the core principle of his being, that in these mountains, his will was law. This new state was a living, breathing rejection of that idea. Campbell's reaction was immediate and visceral, but it wasn't born of simple anger. It was born of pure, cold ambition. A lesser man might have sided with Virginia and tried to crush the upstart state. But the Red Fox saw a different path. His fatal flaw, his absolute belief in his own authority, saw this not as a threat to be destroyed, but as an opportunity to be seized. If there was going to be a new kingdom on the frontier, he would not be its neighbor. He would be its king. He made a fateful choice. He began to scheme, using his vast influence to convince the citizens of his own Washington County, Virginia, to secede from their state and join the state of Franklin. It was a breathtaking act of treason. He was willing to betray the Commonwealth he served, to risk being hanged as a traitor, all for the chance to absorb this new rival power and weld it into a larger domain under his control. This was the point of no return. He had looked upon the challenge to his authority and, driven by his unyielding pride, decided not just to meet it, but to escalate it into an all-or-nothing gamble for absolute power. News of Arthur Campbell's treasonous scheme traveled fast, like a fire in the dry grass of autumn. It didn't take long for it to reach the capital in Richmond and the ears of a man who knew a thing or two about rebellion, Governor Patrick Henry. The governor's response was swift, a letter that was both a velvet glove and an iron fist. He praised Campbell for his past service to Virginia, acknowledging him as a hero of the Revolution. But he also demanded, in no uncertain terms, an explanation for the rumors of secession. It was a calculated move, a political off-ramp offered by one of the most powerful men in the country. It was a chance for the Red Fox to bow, to claim it was all a misunderstanding, and to pull back from the brink without losing face. But Arthur Campbell did not see a lifeline. He saw an insult. Who was Patrick Henry, a man of speeches and cities, to tell him how to govern his mountains? Campbell replied with a letter of his own, a masterpiece of political deflection. He assured the governor of his loyalty to Virginia while simultaneously arguing for the natural right of frontier people to determine their own governance. He was playing a dangerous double game, trying to placate Richmond with words while continuing his secessionist machinations in secret. He was convinced that the state government was too weak and too distant to stop him. His pride blinded him to the reality that he was no longer fighting a disorganized tribe or a local rival. He was challenging the authority of a sovereign state. The warnings didn't just come from Richmond. They came from his own people, from the men who had stood with him at Point Pleasant and shivered through the winter campaigns against the Cherokee. Old allies, men whose loyalty he had never had to question, came to him privately. They spoke not of treason, but of practicality. They warned him that he was splitting the county, pitting families against each other who had once stood united against a common foe. They begged him to reconsider, to find a compromise, to not tear apart the very community he had built with his own hands. Campbell heard their words not as the counsel of friends, but as the whispers of cowards. He saw their caution as a betrayal of the bold, frontier spirit that had won them this land in the first place. He dismissed their concerns, sometimes with a cold stare, sometimes with a sharp reminder of who had led them through the darkest days. Each time an old friend urged him to step back, Campbell pushed them away, convinced they had lost their nerve. His circle of trusted allies began to shrink, replaced by sycophants and hotheads who shared his ambition. He was becoming a general with no army, a king with a shrinking kingdom. Meanwhile, his chief rival, William Russell, seized the opportunity. Russell saw Campbell's treason not just as a danger to Virginia, but as the perfect weapon to finally destroy the Red Fox. He became the leader of the Loyalist faction in Washington County, organizing opposition, holding his own militia musters, and sending a steady stream of reports to Governor Henry, detailing Campbell's every move. The political feud had now escalated into a Cold War fought in the cabins and courtrooms of the Holston Valley. Every choice Campbell made to further his secessionist plot only strengthened Russell's hand and drove a deeper wedge into the heart of the community. The Red Fox was walking a path of his own making, and it was narrowing with every stubborn step. A violent collision was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The Holston Valley had become a powder keg, and everyone could smell the fuse. Militias were drilling on both sides, the Loyalists under William Russell on one green, and Campbell's secessionists on another. Old friends now crossed the road to avoid each other's gaze. Families were split down the middle. The air was thick with the tension of impending civil war. It was in this moment, with the region teetering on the brink of bloodshed, that Arthur Campbell was given one last clear chance to choose a different path. And it came not from a governor or a rival, but from the one person who knew the man behind the legend. One evening, as he sat alone by the fire, poring over maps and lists of men loyal to his cause, his wife Margaret came to him. She was a strong frontier woman, no stranger to hardship or danger, but he could see a profound weariness in her eyes. She carried no political arguments or legal warnings. She carried the weight of their world. She sat beside him and spoke quietly of the fear she saw growing in the community. She told him of the women who stopped her by the creek, asking if it was true that their husbands and sons would soon have to fight their own neighbors. She didn't speak of Virginia or the state of Franklin. She spoke of their own home. She asked him to look at the life they had built, earned, and loss. Was this ambition loss? Was this ambition, this new title in this new state, worth the blood of the very people they had sworn to protect? Was it worth their own sons having to aim a rifle at a cousin or a child in the abstract lure of power and the tangible reality of the family and community he claimed to be serving? For it was silent. The firelight and in the shifting shadows, one could almost him. He looked at his wife, the woman who had stood by him through everything. He saw the precipice, chasm of violence step ahead. He could pull back. He could step ahead. He could pull back. He could send a rider to Russell, call a truce, and begin the hard work of mending what he had broken. He could choose his family over his pride. But then his eyes hardened. To back down now, after going so far, felt like the ultimate defeat. He pictured William Russell's smug faction. He pictured his authority, the very foundation of his identity, crumbling to dust. In his mind, retreat was not a path to peace. It was an invitation for his enemies to destroy him utterly. He turned to Margaret, and the warmth had gone from his voice. "Peace is bought with strength, Margaret," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "To show weakness now is to lose everything we have ever..." The day of the reckoning arrived with the cold bite, the one forced to converge on a single point. But this was no day for civil discourse. Outside the small log courthouse. Outside the small log courthouse. On one side stood the small log courthouse. On one side stood William Russell and the vigilists, a grim line of farmers and militiamen. On the other, his face as hard and unforgiving as the mountains behind him, was Arthur Campbell, long rifles, their knuckles white. Word snatched away by the wind. The final spark. Russell, determined to assert the authority of Virginia, took a deliberate step toward the courthouse door. His hand raised. He declared Campbell's assembly illegal and ordered the men to disperse in the name of the Commonwealth. For the Red Fox, this was the ultimate challenge, a public stripping of his power, an act he could not possibly tolerate. In that instant, the world seemed to narrow for Arthur Campbell. The shouting, the wind, the faces of his own men, it all faded into a dull roar. The only thing he could see with perfect clarity was William Russell, his rival, the one man who stood between him and absolute control. The sun glinted off the barrel of a rifle somewhere to his left. He felt the familiar hand moving toward it with a will of its own, a lifetime of frontier instinct taking over. He had made his decision weeks ago, in the quiet of his own home. This was just the echo. A single sharp report cracked the cold air and the world erupted. It wasn't a battle, it was a chaotic close-quarters brawl of smoke and thunder. Flashes of orange powder burst from the two lines as a ragged volley was exchanged. Men didn't charge so much as stumble forward, the roar of muskets and pistols deafening. Through the swirling, acrid smoke, Campbell saw only one thing. Russell, his face a mask of fury, trying to bring order to his panicked men. The two leaders locked eyes across the maelstrom. For a frozen moment, the entire conflict, the struggle for the soul of the frontier, was reduced to these two men. Their hands moved in a blur of practiced motion. The walls of the courthouse, louder and more final than all the others. The argument that had torn a county in two, that had pitted neighbor against neighbor and brother against brother, was suddenly, permanently over. A chilling, unnatural silence fell over the courthouse green, broken only by the moaning of the wind and the groans of a few wounded men. The powder smoke, thick and grey like a mountain fog, began to slowly clear, revealing the terrible tableau. Men from both sides stood frozen, their weapons half lowered, staring in shock not at an enemy, but at the undeniable consequences of their own rage. Arthur Campbell stood alone in the center of it all. He slowly lowered his pistol, the barrel still smoking in the frigid air. He had won. The challenge to his authority had been met and utterly vanquished. But as he looked out at the wreckage of his community, at the faces of men he had known his entire life, now twisted in horror and grief, there was no triumph in his gaze. There was only the cold, empty silence of a king who had just burned his own kingdom to secure his throne. The sharp crack of the final shot was followed by a silence so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. For a long moment, no one moved. The men on the courthouse green, friends and enemies alike, stood like statues of clay, their faces blank with shock. The Red Fox stood at the center of this frozen tableau, the smoking pistol still heavy in his hand. There was no look of triumph on his face, no flicker of rage or regret. There was only a cold, profound emptiness. The metallic taste of gun smoke filled his mouth. The problem of William Russell had been solved. His instincts, honed over decades of survival, took over. He did not run. He did not surrender. To do either would be to admit he had done something wrong, and in his mind, he had simply restored order. With a slow, deliberate motion that drew every eye, he began to reload his pistol. It was a terrifyingly calm gesture, an unmistakable message to every man on that green. The violence was done, but his capacity for it was not. He was still the most dangerous man in the valley. With his weapon reloaded and tucked back into his belt, he turned his back on the body of his fallen rival. He did not give it a second glance. He looked to his own men, who were staring at him with a mixture of awe and fear. His voice cut through the silence. Not a shout, but a low command that carried with its own absolute authority. "See to our wounded," he ordered. "Then disarm the rest of them. Their foolishness is at an end." He was no longer a politician or a rebel. He was a general on a battlefield of his own making, and he was taking control of the field. Without another word, he walked through the stunned crowd. Men, both his own and Russell's, parted before him, their eyes avoiding his. He moved not like a man fleeing a crime, but like a landowner inspecting his property. He reached his horse, swung himself into the saddle, and rode away from the courthouse, shattered by his actions. The conflict was over. He had gambled everything on a single violent act, and he had won. But as he rode into the cold hills, the end of this road was simply the beginning of another, far more treacherous one. The law of the mountains had been satisfied. Now he would have to face the law of man. The echo of that final gunshot on the courthouse green did not fade. It settled into the soil of Washington County like a poison, contaminating everything it touched. The act of violence didn't end the conflict. It transformed a political dispute into a wound that would heal. The men who had faced off against each other went home that day, but they did not go home to peace. They carried the ghost of the confrontation with them, and it sat at their dinner and whispered to them in their sleep. For the family of Russell, the world had been turned upside. They were now a family without a patriarch, their name forever linked to a public violent death at the hands of their greatest rival. Their grief quickly hardened into a cold, simmering hatred that would be passed down like an inheritance. Every Campbell they saw, every mention of the Red Fox name, was a fresh twist of the knife, a balancing of the scales, a debt that they would wait years, even generations, to collect if they had to. But the wreckage was not confined to one side. Arthur Campbell had won the field, but they were now the clan of the killer. Respect was replaced by fear, and faced by a cautious, resentful distance. His wife, Margaret, now had to live the very nightmare she had foreseen, facing the accusing eyes of children growing up under the shadow of their father's violence. They were safe, yes, but were surrounded by a wall of silent condemnation, built by their father's own hands. The grand political session was dead, drowned in the blood on the courthouse lawn. The state of Franklin, seeing the fratricidal violence Campbell's ambition had unleashed, wanted no part of Washington County. Campbell had broken his own community for a prize that no longer existed. The energy of the frontier, once directed outward against the wilderness and external threats, was turned inward. The project of building a civilization ground to a halt, consumed by suspicion and bitterness. The tragedy of that day wasn't just the death of one man, it was the death of trust. The Red Fox, in his obsessive quest to protect his community's order, had shattered its soul. The news of William Russell's death and the armed insurrection at the courthouse galloped all the way to Richmond, and this time, Governor Patrick Henry could not respond with a mere letter. The Commonwealth of Virginia had been openly defied, its authority challenged by one of its own. A charge of murder was drawn up against the Campbell, and the slow, heavy machinery of the law began its way. It was a clash of two worlds, set to play out in the very log courthouse where the blood had been spilled. The trial. On one side stood the prosecutor from Richmond, a man of books and statutes, who spoke of malice aforethought and conspiracy. Clear, legalistic case. Arthur Campbell, in his lust for power, had raised a private army, defied the state and its loyal representative. To the world outside the mountains, the case was open and shut. But the prosecutor wasn't speaking to the world. Speaking to a jury of 12 grim-faced frontiersmen, men who had known both Campbell and Russell their entire lives. When Arthur Campbell spoke in his own defense, he did not plead or make excuses. He stood before the jury not as a criminal, but as their patriarch, their war leader, explaining a difficult but necessary decision. He didn't speak the language of the law. He spoke the language of... He argued that William Russell's actions were a direct threat to the stability and survival of their entire community. He wasn't just a political opponent, he was an agent of chaos. In the unwritten, brutal constitution of the frontier, a direct challenge to the established leader in a time of crisis was a declaration of war. He framed his act not as murder, but as a battlefield necessity, the regrettable but unavoidable a wider, bloodier conflict. He looked into the eyes of the jurors, many of whom he had led through fire and snow, and silently asked them, "Which law do you truly live by, theirs or ours?" The community, and the jury with it, was ripped in two. The Russell clan and their allies lauded murderer on trial and demanded the gallows, but many more saw something else. The man who had kept their families safe for decades, judged by a distant, alien set of rules that didn't understand their world. The jurors were caught in an impossible position. To convict Campbell would be to defy the most powerful man they had ever known, a man whose clan could make their lives a living hell. To acquit him would be to sanction a killing and invite the eternal vengeance of the Russell family. In the end, after a tense deliberation, the verdict was read in the silent, crowded courtroom. Not guilty. A gasp went through the room, of outrage from one side and profound, grim relief from the other. Arthur Campbell simply nodded, his expression unchanging, and walked out a free man. But was justice served? Not by any modern standard. The verdict was not a statement of innocence, it was a verdict of fear and loyalty. It was a declaration that in the Holston River Valley, the law of Virginia was merely a suggestion. The true law of the Red Fox. The court had washed its hands of the matter, but in doing so, it had left the blood debt unpaid, leaving it to fester in the different kind of judgment. William Russell's story, of course, ended on that frozen patch of ground outside the courthouse. He paid the price in his feud with the Red Fox, his life cut short by a pistol ball. But it would be a mistake to remember him as a simple martyr, a righteous man cut down by an unhinged villain. The truth, as it always in the mountains, is far more complicated. Russell was no saint. He was a formidable rival, cut from the same hard, ambitious cloth as Campbell himself. Their feud was a clash of two mountain lions fighting for the same territory. When Campbell began his treasonous plot, Russell didn't just see a threat to Virginia. He saw his ultimate opportunity to finally break the Red Fox's power. He was not just a patriot defending his state. He was a political predator moving in for the kill. And in a bitter twist of frontier justice, William Russell achieved in death what he could not guarantee in life. His violent, public end became a symbol of Campbell's tyrannical overreach. The sheer brutality of the act horrified the very people Campbell was trying to lead. Any romantic notions of creating a new frontier republic were washed away in the blood of a neighbor. The state of Franklin, witnessing the fratricidal chaos, recoiled from the idea of admitting Campbell's fractured county into their union. The secession movement died right there on the courthouse green alongside the man who had opposed it. So, who truly won? Arthur Campbell walked away a free man, but his grand political scheme was left in ashes, and his reputation was forever stained with a kinsman's blood. He had won the personal duel, but lost the political war. William Russell lay in a cold grave, but his cause, county tethered to Virginia, had triumphed. His death ensured the very outcome he had fought for. It was a messy, unsatisfying and tragic end for both men, proving that on the frontier, sometimes even the victor loses everything that matters. Arthur Campbell lived for another 2 decades after the trial, a wealthy and powerful old man who died in his bed in 1811. He was, by all accounts, a success. He had built a dynasty, amassed a fortune in land, and all his enemies. But the victory he had secured on the courthouse green was a bitter one, and its poison seeped into the long years that followed. He was no longer the beloved patriarch of the Holston Valley. He was its feared and isolated king, ruling over a kingdom of silent resentment. Unity did what always do after a deep trauma. They buried it under a blanket of silence. The courthouse shooting was not spoken of in public. It became a dark secret that everyone knew, but no one acknowledged. A ghost at every wedding and funeral. People had to live together, to raise barns and fight fires side by side, so they forced a fragile peace. But the trust was gone. The old bonds of unquestioning loyalty had been severed, and in their watchful suspicion. The legacy of that day was carried their father's land and influence, but also the stain of his name. They had to navigate a world where many of their neighbors saw them not as friends, but as the offspring of a tyrant. The Russell clan, meanwhile, became the keepers of the grudge. The story of William Russell's death became their family's founding myth, a tale of martyrdom that fueled a quiet, patient hatred that would simmer for generations, waiting for any opportunity to settle the score. As the years passed, the world changed around the aging Red Fox. The frontier pushed further west, and the Holston Valley became a more settled, civilized place. New leaders emerged, men who fought their legislative chambers and courtrooms, not with pistols on the lawn. Campbell's brutal personal style of authority became a relic of a bygone era. The very civilization he had bled to establish was now making him obsolete. He had won the right to rule his mountain, but in the end, the mountain had simply grown past him, leaving him a lonely, feared figure, forever haunted by the silence of the community he had broken. If you travel today through the mountains of southwestern Virginia, you can still find the tracks of the Red Fox. The land he claimed is still there, crisscrossed by roads and dotted with towns he never could have imagined. Near the town of Marion, you can find the site of his home, Campbell's Choice. And in the old Royal Oak Cemetery, you can lay a hand on his weathered tombstone. These are the cold, hard facts of his life, carved in stone and written on deeds. Campbell doesn't live in the graveyards or the history books. It lives in the whispers. Over the centuries, the man has been consumed by the myth. The stories told about him in the hollows are not or legislative vote. They are about the uncanny cunning that no ordinary man should possess. He learned their magic. They say a shaman taught him how to walk between the worlds, to move like a shadow through the woods, and know man before it was even formed. How else could he appear from nowhere to strike the Cherokee, or anticipate every move of his political rivals? The darkest legends, of course, are told by the descendants of those he destroyed. They still tell the story of a Cherokee medicine man who laid a curse upon the Red Fox. He decreed that Campbell's spirit would never know peace, but would be forced to wander the ruins of the towns he burned for all eternity, his fiery red hair blazing in the gloom, forever hearing the ghostly cries of the starving and the slain. It is this story that gives the hook its power, the idea that a man's violence could so profoundly scar a landscape is forever trapped there. Arthur Campbell is more than a historical figure now. He is a Corsi man, a local legend. He is the human face of the brutal bargain that was struck to settle these mountains. His name is whispered to remind children of the darkness that lies in ambition, and to remind adults that the foundations of their peaceful homes are built upon acts of terrible, unforgiving violence. The man is long dead, but his spirit, the embodiment of that ruthless, brilliant and terrifying frontier will, still haunts these mountains. For better or for worse, the shadow of the red fox is a part of the land itself. We return to the question we asked at the beginning. Sitting here in the long shadow of the mountains, was Arthur Campbell a hero or... The truth is, he was something far more complicated and far more human. He was a founder. He was one of those hard, uncompromising men who carved a civilization out of a wilderness. Such work is never clean. To his people, he was a shield. To the Cherokee, he was a specter of destruction. To his rival, he was a tyrant. The Red Fox, embodiment of the frontier itself, creative and destructive, magnificent and terrible, a force of nature that built a new world by clearing